Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Wake BRT Western Boulevard Corridor Study virtual Q&A. My name is Austin Bowman, and I'm an urban designer with the City of Raleigh and one of the design staff on the project. Tonight, we will be giving a brief presentation on the contents of the report and taking your questions. At any time, if you have a question, please feel free to leave it in the comments section next to your streaming screen, or you can call in to public input and you'll be connected to the Zoom during the Q&A portion of the session. The call-in number is just below your streaming window. Please note that there's a code and an admin pin that you'll need to enter as well to get into the queue, and a automated direction system will let you know how to ask your questions. As I said earlier, staff is briefly going to walk through the contents of the report and the process of how we got here, and then we'll get to the questions. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Danya Sandeep, the project manager for the city, to get us started.
All right, thank you, Austin. Good evening to everyone. Thank you again for joining us this evening. So again, I'm Danya Sandeep. I'm one of the senior open designers with the city's Open Design Center, and also the project manager for the Western Boulevard Corridor Study. So I'm going to kick off this presentation with a very brief overview of the project scope, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague who's going to review the open design recommendations of the study. Next. So to quickly recap, this corridor study is really focused on planning and leveraging the opportunities around the bus rapid transit that's being planned along Western Boulevard that will connect downtown Raleigh to downtown Cary. So on the screen, you will see this map. This shows the study area that we focused on. Much of the planning and design analysis focused on Western Boulevard section between downtown Raleigh and I-40. We also included properties within a half-mile buffer, which is typically considered the 10-minute walking distance. Also on the map, you see the highlighted yellow line, which is the locally preferred alternative or the selected bus route that will connect downtown Raleigh and downtown Cary. And as you can see, is proposed along the new western extension shown in dotted lines and eventually connect to the existing segment of the Cary Town Boulevard segment. Next slide. So the corridor study scope included three major focus areas. The first, the land use and market analysis. This was primarily led by the consultant team, and it looked at the development capacity and potential along the corridor. We do have a report that's released and available for your review. The second piece, which is the LP analysis, much of that was looking at selecting the best BRT route, and again, led by consultants. And I think the previous map showed the LPA. So the LPA was endorsed and adopted by both Raleigh Council as well as Town of Cary Council in fall of 2020. And the last section, the open design opportunities, this was scoped in-house by the city's Open Design Center team and really focused on physical improvements that looked at right-of-way opportunities as well as enhanced infrastructure improvements, all of which could leverage on the upcoming BRT investments. And again, the overall goal is to help transform the auto-centric corridor into a much safer, walkable, transit-oriented gateway. Next. A quick look at the timeline of this project. Again, we kicked off in late fall of 2019. And of course, we had on-site engagement, but then very soon we got into the pandemic mode. So our second touch point was all virtual in fall of 2020. But we are very excited to get into the final phase now where we just released the report online. We are taking feedback and there's an online survey that you can take. So if you haven't had a chance yet, please do check it out and give us your feedback. I do want to note that the design phase for the BRT project has also just kicked off, and this overlaps with the planning phase in a way. And I want to clarify that the design phase is what will actually look at the details of how BRT will integrate with the existing right-of-way on Western Boulevard. So if you're looking for street cross sections or to confirm the existing station locations, all of that is going to happen in the design phase that just kicked off, and that is being led by the city's transit division. Next slide. So we had ample opportunities for engaging the community, and we got a lot of great feedback. And we also identified some top priority areas for the community that felt had to be addressed through our planning efforts. So the first and foremost, pedestrian and bicycle connectivity. This ranked really high. And again, it's not a surprise because we all recognize how the existing infrastructure is so poor and inadequate. The next was the intersection safety, which again, a lot of the crash data shows how dangerous some of these intersections are and how much of a challenge it is to really cross and traverse Western Boulevard today. So transit supportive, a lot of folks recognize that we need to add additional density and mixed uses to support transit use along the corridor. And this is also keeping in mind that we want to support the city's holistic goals of equitable development, affordable housing, and accommodating future growth in a sustainable way. And last but not least, sustainable design. This was noted as important, especially for the ecologically sensitive areas of the corridor. And so all of these priorities really guided the selection of the themes we have included in the report. Next slide. So what's next? I think I mentioned that we do have this the report that's released. So we do have an online survey that's active till June 14th. So once we are done with that, we will make further updates to the report, and we hope to get through the adoption process in fall of this year. Again, that would entail Planning Commission and eventually City Council review. And beyond that, all of these recommendations is also going to feed into the BRT design process that just kicked off. I also want to quickly note that there is a TOD text change, which is a zoning overlay text change that is also ongoing. And so keeping all of this in mind, what's next for Western, right? So we know the design phase is kicked off, but what you're looking for and what you want to plan for is beyond this planning phase, we will see the TOD mapping process as well as the upcoming station area planning process, again, all of which will be coming up in the near future, so stay tuned. Next. A quick note about implementation. So a lot of recommendations in the report will also get translated into policies, actionable items, and also capital projects, and also some guidance on area specific guidance, which will include a chapter for Western Boulevard, and all of that will eventually get adopted into the comprehensive plan package along with the report. So do stay tuned for that. We hope to release the comprehensive plan staff report sometime in June. And you definitely want to stay tuned for streets, new streets, bikeway connections, greenway connections, all of which are being recommended for adoption into the comprehensive plan. Next. So tonight's focus is really on urban design. Next. So the scope of urban design is really to see how design opportunities can help transform Western Boulevard into a much safer, a multimodal, well-connected, vibrant, walkable, sustainable transit corridor of the future. So as you will see, all of the recommendations we have included in our report is going to help us achieve this holistic vision or long-term goal of transforming Western into a successful BRT corridor of the future. And keep in mind that some of the land use element will be coming up in the station area planning process, as well as some of the street cross sections. All of that will be addressed in the design phase that's just kicked off. And with that, I'm now going to turn it over to Carly Stevenson. Carly is a landscape designer and part of our core design team who worked on this project, and she's going to walk us through some of the urban design recommendations of the study. And with that, thank you. And Carly, all yours.
Great, thank you, Danya. So I'm going to kick things off with just briefly talking about how our report was organized. This is a very long corridor, around 12 miles, that crosses lots of different land uses and contexts. So in order to make that a little more digestible, we split it up into 6 zones. And each zone represents an area with a similar land use, similar challenges and opportunities. And so within these zones, we looked at major intersecting corridors. We looked at frequent transit routes, future development, and planned projects. and identified large catalytic properties that are prime for transit-oriented development. So these sites will be considered as part of a larger and more comprehensive TOD mapping that Danya mentioned, an effort that's taking place at a later date. So there will be more sites and parcels of different types and scales that will be considered as that process gets underway. So also things that we pointed out or identified along the corridor are places with unique opportunities or challenges that require more in-depth analysis and urban design concepting. And while each of the 6 zones have their unique challenges and opportunities, we were able to identify some overarching themes that apply generally across the corridor. And so all of our recs fall under one or all of these themes. And those include multimodal connectivity, public realm enhancements, environmental sustainability, and transit-oriented development. So I'm going to go through each zone and briefly talk about the focus for that zone overall, and then pick out a few examples where we're zooming into specific spots along the corridor that we've labeled urban design opportunities. There are way too many to talk through every single one, so this is a snapshot. Please go through and review the report if you are interested in a specific zone or area, and of course, we can answer questions about that in our panel later if you have specific questions. So in the downtown zone, there were 2 opportunity areas that were identified, the intersection with Wilmington and Salisbury Streets and Dawson and McDowell. So this vignette showcases the recommendations for Wilmington and Salisbury Street. So challenges at this location include long, uncomfortable crossings and the way that Salisbury intersects with Western Boulevard cuts in at an awkward angle that takes up a lot of space that could be dedicated to pedestrians, but instead is dedicated to cars. So solutions in this area include a realignment of Salisbury Street at more of a right angle into Western Boulevard, thus opening up some space for an array of different opportunities, including landscaping, green stormwater infrastructure, other placemaking elements. To help with the crossings, we're proposing medians and curb extensions that could help shorten these crossings and make them safer. Also, there is a potential BRT station that's located north on Wilmington from this intersection. So having good pedestrian and bicycle facilities to connect to and from that station will be very important moving forward. So each opportunity area includes images or a separate spread that provides examples of urban design solutions that have been implemented by other cities. So these are sprinkled throughout the report. And this is an example, or this is the spread that we used for the Wilmington and Salisbury intersection. What we liked about this is the large, well-marked crosswalks, the dedicated median running transit lanes, and the activated corners with plenty of space for pedestrians to queue and gather and cross. So moving on to the park zone, due to its proximity with Dix Park and Pullen Park, the most opportunity areas were identified along here. There's a lot of planning underway as part of the Dix Park master plan. So a lot of collaboration happened with the parks team, the Dix Park team, and the greenways teams to really talk about the design language and future plans for the park and how we can pull that into the corridor. So this is a concept proposed by our team for the South Saunders Bridge. Challenges here include the elevation change. There is a potential station that will be on or near the bridge over South Saunders Street. And so physically connecting South Saunders Street with Western Boulevard will be a challenge. The bridge itself is dark and unwelcoming. There's a lot of overgrowth and vegetation. There's a narrow sidewalk along South Saunders Street and no bicycle facilities. And South Saunders leads directly or will lead directly to one of the main entrances to Dix Park and also connects with a greenway entrance just to the south. So the solutions here propose expanding the public realm and including a stepped connection to the station above. There are bike lanes and crosswalks that are added, the crosswalk leading to a Go Raleigh station that's just across the street. For the bridge, we are thinking of that as a canvas. There could be lighting and art and other wayfinding elements that really help announce that you are approaching Dix Park or entering downtown. This plan is a graphic pulled from the report that's focused on the Boylan Heights area, specifically the Boylan Avenue intersection and Dorothea Drive. So challenges here: Boylan Avenue is an unsafe intersection for all users. The current crosswalk and signals are offset from where Boylan meets Western, making sightlines and visibility difficult. There are also narrow sidewalks that end abruptly and no bicycle infrastructure in this location on Western. And one of the main reasons for this lack of pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure is that the right-of-way narrows as Western moves west in preparation for crossing under the railroad bridge. So that creates a pinch point that bike lanes and sidewalks may not fit comfortably on the north side. There's also a recurring issue with flooding that happens at the Boylan Avenue intersection. So overall, this area is just not super welcoming or inviting, especially thinking about this being one of the main entry points from downtown into Dix Park in the future. So some solutions that we looked at is normalizing the intersection at Boylan Avenue, so squaring off those crosswalks and shortening them. There's also a city-owned property that is nestled into the corner of the intersection with Boylan Avenue and Western, just to the east. So this is a prime location for green stormwater infrastructure. It could be, a plaza or placemaking, a real expansion of the public realm that helps feed into the park. And then also, rather than squeezing bicycle or pedestrian infrastructure on the north side of Western Boulevard, our idea is to direct those users to Dorothea Drive. So there could be a bike lane or a bikeway that traverses along Dorothea Drive, avoiding the squished position or the squished conditions of Western Boulevard at that area. And bicycle and pedestrian users on Dorothea Drive could then cross where the curve happens and merge back onto the existing multi-use path that would then merge back onto Western Boulevard. So we think this could be a really seamless transition for the bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. There's also currently vacant property under the railroad bridge in this location that could be used for all sorts of things. It could be a pocket park, dog park, or other public amenity space. It's just something to be explored. This illustrated plan showcases recommendations for the opportunity areas at Ash Avenue and Pullen Road. Main ideas here are to reduce the footprint and alignment of the intersections to give space back to the parks and the pedestrian. So the expanded space could really become a seamless linear park that moves people between the campus to Pullen Park and then down to Dix Park. And Pullen Road will house a potential BRT station, so that interchange will need to have clear, comfortable connections to the station from Pullen Road and Western Boulevard. So those will be really important things to consider. This is a street level vignette that reflects the look and feel of how pedestrians and bicycles may navigate the interchange, exiting from Western Boulevard and approaching the BRT station at Pullen. So elements here that help with comfort are plantings and buffers between bikers and pedestrians from the traffic of Western Boulevard, and lighting and wide separated multi-use paths. So this could really become an extension space of the parks. So people exit the BRT station and there is signage and lighting directing users either to campus or to continue on their way to Pullen Park or eventually Dix Park, all working as a unit. So the next section that we're diving into is the campus zone. So there's a large section of Western Boulevard that fronts NC State's property. So we have limited scope in what we can implement, but we did identify an opportunity area that overlaps with a large catalytic site, a potential transit-oriented development site, which is the Mission Valley Shopping Center. So this diagram summarizes the recommendations for this zone. There are a lot of players at this intersection. There's NC State University and the private development and shopping center. There's also overlap in this area from the adopted plan for Avon Ferry, which details out different development scenarios for Mission Valley. And it also proposes some street connections and bike and ped connections. So a lot of the recommendations that are illustrated here pull from that plan, as well as NC State's plans for their campus. This is a look and feel slide that provides precedent imagery for how this space could transform in the future. So the next two zones we have combined and are talking about as one, though there are certainly details and contexts that differ and make the zones unique. Namely the Method commercial zone. There's a lot of commercial and drive-through frontage along that section. The multimodal link a little further to the west has a lot of residential type development, but they face many of the same challenges, and therefore we're going to talk about them together during this presentation. Each have an opportunity area that's identified along the corridor, along with the potential catalytic transit-oriented development site that is also highlighted. So both sites are and will be affected by the I-440 interchange that's currently under construction. Post-construction, crossing the interchange by foot or bike should be much easier, and our recommendations are building off of that network gap that's being filled. However, the areas lack comfortable multimodal connections between Western Boulevard, NC State's East Campus in this area, and then the surrounding neighborhoods and communities. With the introduction of BRT to Western and potential stations at both the Method Road and Blue Ridge Road, the area will need to really beef up its bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. And so the streets that we are proposing will house that infrastructure and really help this area become more of a connected gridded network that will lay a foundation for denser, more walkable development that's fitting for this location. Signalized crossings and safer crossings are also a big need in this area that are highlighted in the yellow circles. And this spread shows some precedent examples of how these areas could look and feel in the future. So next zone is our last zone. It's the Cary Connector Zone. And this includes the Western Boulevard BRT extension, which will be a new, completely unbuilt infrastructure. But this really gives us an opportunity to build a street that specializes in moving people and transit in a context and environmentally sensitive way. So the idea of green transit-oriented development is really brought to the front here for this zone. And the green transit-oriented development is a planning and urban design approach that prioritizes ecological and human health. So the 3 opportunity areas and then the 1 TOD site at the current Plaza West location make recommendations that really tie into that environmental sustainability theme. So in addition to the higher densities and walkability of a traditional TOD, the areas called out in this zone could really incorporate additional strategies that meet the following goals, like energy efficient buildings, green stormwater infrastructure, places for people rather than cars, and interconnected green spaces. So this precedent slide highlights what some of that could look like. This diagram shows how the new BRT extension could move through the area north of Buck Jones Road that intersects with the end of Wolfwood Drive, where a potential BRT station is planned. So the planned extension crosses several streams and tributaries and other sensitive environmental areas. So development and new infrastructure along this part of the corridor should really minimize the impact on environmental systems as much as possible. So in this diagram, we've highlighted parcels in green and blue that are tagged as sites that could provide the best and greatest benefit if reserved for green development or infrastructure to offset some of what would be done with the extension moving through these sensitive areas. So new streets, multi-use paths, and greenway connections are also proposed in this area to really better connect the surrounding neighborhoods and also connect these neighborhoods with open spaces. So finally, I'm going to quickly show the various corridor-wide networks that will help stitch together all these recommendations we just went through. So the streets identified in this map will be adopted into Map T1, part of Raleigh's comprehensive plan. You can see like some more hashed out gridding that happens around the transit-oriented development sites. And that is intentional. Well-planned street grids encourage safe and walkable development. And this is particularly important around areas that are designated as potential TOD sites. The recommended bike facilities will update Raleigh's bike plan. So specifically, the lines shown in pink and dark blue, which represent bikeways and bike lanes. These will also be adopted into Map T3, part of Raleigh's comprehensive plan. So you'll notice a lot of the pink lines are showing up to the west of the study area and intersecting with the extension. So that was an area that we really wanted to beef up with better bicycle and pedestrian facilities, because we know that they're lacking, the connectivity is really lacking in that zone. And these recommendations, the area-specific guidance recommendations, reflect a holistic analysis of the corridor and include the catalytic TOD sites, proposed greenway trails and corridors, streets that we're encouraging or recommending as part of future development or redevelopment, open space opportunities and intersection improvements. So all of these elements become part of the area-specific guidance for the Western Boulevard Corridor Study and help accomplish the corridor's vision for multimodal connectivity, transit-oriented development, public realm enhancements, and environmental sustainability. And finally, this map identifies areas that the team honed in on through high-level overview as containing some sort of environmental opportunity or challenge. What is on this map are greenway trails, green stormwater infrastructure locations, open space acquisition, conversion, or conservation space, and areas needing additional study or consideration due to sensitive environmental factors. So places where the corridor crosses streams or floodplains. And with that, I'm going to wrap up my portion of the presentation and hand it back over to Austin, who's going to introduce our Q&A panel.
Great, thanks Carly and Danya. So I'm going to quickly introduce our Q&A panel and then get into questions. Like I said earlier, feel free to call in or leave questions in the comment box next to the streaming video. We have a list of questions on our end that we've gotten by email from citizens and also as part of the survey that we'll be asking in between getting comments from those of you who are viewing live. So without further ado, you've already met Carly and Danya. So we also have with us Joe Michael, who's the principal urban designer at the Urban Design Center and also worked extensively on this project. We have Jason Myers from our transportation planning department, who we worked with a great deal on the bike and street networks. Jason Harden from planning and development, who's managing the TOD overlay process as well as station area planning projects. and Het Patel from our transit division, who is working on all of the BRT segments for planning, design, and construction. And then, of course, myself here as a resource as well. So Carly, if you want to stop sharing your screen, we can get right into questions. So I will start with some of the questions we got via email and in the comments on the survey. And something that continues to come up, as is no surprise to any of us or anyone who's ever experienced Western, is safety. And so I think the first question I want to give to Jason and Het. So are there considerations as part of the BRT implementation for reducing speed on the road to increase safety? That came up a lot in the survey.
Thanks, Austin. Yeah, I can start, and then Jason, if you have anything else to add, you can. So the corridor itself is a NCDOT right-of-way corridor, and so any work that we do from a speed reduction perspective, I want to mention that we would be coordinating with NCDOT on that work and looking at what potential options are. We do currently just have begun the 0 to 30% design phase that Danya mentioned for the Western corridor. So we are looking at a couple segments along the corridor where it may make sense to maybe potentially reduce the speed down to 35. Currently, the corridor is pretty high speeds all the way through in its travel patterns. And so we would be looking at that as part of the traffic analysis that's done in that 0 to 30% design phase and coordinating with NCDOT.
Thanks, Het. Jason, do you have anything to add?
No, I don't think I can add a whole lot to that. As Het said, NCDOT controls things like the speed limit and the design speed of the street. And, you know, in a lot of ways, the BRT project implementation of the infrastructure is going to be an opportunity to re-engineer that, but at their discretion and at their control. So one of the things that we can take from this process is if that is something that's very important to citizens and stakeholders, that's something we can try to achieve, but the city of Raleigh can't promise anything about that, unfortunately. It's not our decision to make, it's the state's.
Great, thanks, Jason. It's kind of a follow-up to that. In addition to installation of bike lanes, which we certainly heard a lot of advocacy for, can the right-of-way be altered to make new riders more comfortable? So there was a lot of concern for those riders who aren't very experienced, who kind of that standard bike lane treatment might still not be comfortable enough for them. So what are some additional steps in addition to that kind of baseline that can be made along the corridor to make new riders feel safe and encourage people who currently would not ride on Western Boulevard feel comfortable doing so?
I can start that off. I think part of the question is also Het's answer as the manager of the design process. But the city of Raleigh has designated Western Boulevard as a separated bikeway in our bike plan. And we're right now processing 2 text changes that have been authorized by City Council to change our street standards to basically completely align the Bike Raleigh plan that says that we shouldn't have bike lanes in a high volume street like this with our actual design standards. Part of that would be moving towards side paths, which in many parts of Western Boulevard already exist. In a more suburban context, which a lot of Western Boulevard is right now, it's generally a best practice bike facility to have what looks a lot like a greenway trail set off from the road, maybe 6 to 10 feet. So a lot of the sections around Dix Park, Pullen Park, and the university all have that in existence now. Other sections have a very much substandard side path, which I think we hope to upgrade. And then there's a lot of missing segments that we'll also be looking at through that BRT design process. And then finally, the section of Western Boulevard, which has been called in our thoroughfare plans for decades, the Western Boulevard extension, doesn't exist. And so we have the opportunity to build a greenfield street as we want it. And as long as we've been thinking about Western Boulevard, that street being the alignment for BRT or being a possibility, and now the locally preferred alternative, we've realized that new street doesn't need to carry 4 lanes of vehicle traffic. just having the simple access of 2 lanes plus the bus lane that's separate from traffic is going to be enough. So where one of those design, street cross-section changes that's being worked on right now is to create a standard for a busway street section that basically allows the city to require developers to dedicate right-of-way in places where we want to have a specific bus lane separate from traffic, and to kind of memorialize that into our street standards very specifically. And those will also include separated bikeways. So I think that answers the question, but I want Het to also weigh in on how that process will go forward for the BRT project.
Yeah, definitely, I can do that. So for example, if you participated in any of the Q&As for the other corridors that we had on New Bern, we currently are planning for a separated multi-use path along the entire corridor, and that's part of the BRT design. So I think where the opportunities present themselves along Western Boulevard, we would also be looking at potential separated multi-use path improvements that can be made, as well as sidewalks on the other side of the road. So kind of completing those gaps where possible. I would add, I guess, we are in a fiscally constrained program with the BRT program. So at a certain point, if the corridor itself is constrained from a right-of-way perspective, there may not be a whole lot that the BRT design at this moment, could get from right-of-way to physically separate bicycle lanes in certain sections. And so we just have to kind of work through the design to find out where those locations are, and where, as Jason mentioned, through future redevelopment and through the street designations, we're able to dedicate some right-of-way as development occurs, and then are able to get some separated bike lanes added once the BRT may be done.
Great, thank you both. So I kind of want to shift gears a little bit and talk about some comments that came up more on the western end of the corridor, where we really start to get into more residential areas, less commercial development, less mixed-use development today. And a lot of people brought up the need for more density and the different types, or the different manners in which that can be achieved. So I think next question for both Danya, I think, and Jason Harden, and maybe Joe. In the more residential areas on the western portion of the corridor, how can greater density with more affordable housing be achieved in this more residential context that today is really dominated by single-family homes?
So I'll start with that, and then Donnie and Joe can add as they see fit. So one strategy that's under serious consideration now, not just in this area, but in fact across the city, is the idea of so-called missing middle housing. And that's the concept that under current zoning in Raleigh and a lot of other cities, largely only 2 types of housing are built, either individual detached single-family houses, or where multifamily housing is permitted, multi-story apartment buildings. And those types in the middle, the so-called missing types, such as duplexes or townhouses or triplexes, actually the sort of housing types you see in older neighborhoods all across Raleigh, Boylan Heights, Oakwood, many other places that were common and still are, but aren't permitted in current zoning. Allowing those housing types can be a way of achieving what some people call gentle density, or again, just allowing more housing choice and options in these places. And these housing types are inherently more affordable. They may not be quote unquote affordable housing, but they are more affordable than a larger detached single family house, because they have less space, they're using up less land per unit. And so that is one of many strategies that the city can use to both provide some, or allow some more density around areas served by transit, and to allow more affordable housing types.
I just want to add on to that. I think along with the missing middle, we are also looking at the transit overlay district, and I think Jason probably can expand a little more on the incentives. And so there is a text change, as I mentioned in my presentation. We have a text change for the transit overlay district, which is a zoning tool we have. And we get tweaking that essentially to allow for some of those incentives, especially added density bonus, so to allow for affordable housing. So, again, it will be built upon the base zoning district, but then you would get additional bonus heights where if you would integrate affordable housing into the development. So I think that is a really good tool that's coming forward. And I think it kind of complements that. There's also a layer of that TOD, which is the TOD residential TODR, which is again looking at specifically residential zoning or residential uses predominantly in a certain area of this station node, and how that can be perhaps applied to achieve that density. And there's a slight difference between what the missing middle Jason mentioned versus the TODR, because TODR would allow even smaller lot sizes than what would be allowed by the generic missing middle. So I think so we do definitely have that tool coming forward, and eventually we would have a mapping process where we would look to make some decisions on where the TOD could apply. So that's one way to allow for that tool to give those benefits. And again, once we know that the transit is coming along the corridor, there's always opportunities to densify. We have enough policies in the EDAT or the Equitable Development Plan that talks about densifying. We've once the station areas are specified, we have station typologies, and the comprehensive plan talks about additional densities that can be achieved in those. So I think there are enough tools already in place that should property owners have, any thoughts about looking or seeing how they may these properties could redevelop or leverage on BRT opportunities. I think we already have some. And again, and then of course the simple tool is you could always come in and request a rezoning of your base zoning district. And again, given the notion of for us setting a long-term goal, we want to achieve 30% growth within our BRT corridor. So I think that basically says you are going to, allow and be open to added densities along those corridors. So I think that's kind of what I think we already have. And I think people need to realize that there's opportunities they can realize from the existing residential zone. I don't know if Joe had anything else to add. Joe.
Thank you.
I think y'all covered it very well. So we'll go on. We'll move on.
Great, thanks. So kind of as a follow-up to that, there was a lot of commentary in the survey from people talking about kind of an auto-centric culture and attitude in development and in planning and design. And I'm not sure that there's a right answer here, but I think a lot of people express concern about the city not pulling away from that auto-centric mindset in development and culture. So I think, you've kind of already talked about TOD, but how does the city plan at a higher level to kind of pull away from that auto-centric development and culture along the BRT corridors? And how can the city really encourage people to adopt transit ridership, walking and cycling, especially in these corridors? And that can really, anyone can feel free to jump in on that one.
I think I can give that a start. Culture is a difficult thing, and I don't know that city staff or this planning process can really claim to have a goal of changing a city's culture necessarily. But what we can certainly do is make sure that we have the policies in place to enable things that may not be possible or may not seem possible right now or may not feel comfortable or feel safe. And I think the city has made a lot of progress in the time that I've been on city staff, which is about 8 years, and I think that goes back maybe 4 or 5 years before that, in putting walking first, putting biking ahead of other things, putting transit maybe first, even ahead of bikes probably. But the thing is that that takes a lot of time to as infrastructure and service improves, for that to create a network enough for people to change how they make decisions and how their behavior is reflected by the built environment. And it takes time to actually build out that change in the built environment after we adopt different policies and different standards. So for instance, throughout, I think, the 90s and the early 2000s, if you did a residential subdivision in the city of Raleigh, you were required to put a sidewalk on one side of the street. And before that, there's a period of time where there was no sidewalks required at all in those developments. Now, if there's a new subdivision, sidewalks are required on both sides, and all new developments that go through a tier 3 site plan process are required to build a sidewalk. But those build little segments, and it takes public projects sometimes to fill in the gaps between those segments, and that takes a lot of time. I do think that the BRT project and the implementation of that service is an opportunity to do a lot of new infrastructure, both for the buses and for people to get to the buses all at once. But maybe most importantly, it's going to add a lot of frequency, reliability, and visibility to the bus system itself, which there is transit on Western Boulevard now, and people use it. But the reliability of that, the capacity of that, the comfort of that, and the speed of it is going to make it even a better option. And that's where I think I should probably let Het tell us a little bit more about how this is fitting into our transit planning and our goals for transit.
Yeah, Jason, thanks for setting that up. And I would say, I mean, I think what you said is all really good points. And ultimately, if any kind of change from a cultural perspective, you have to start with providing options and providing good options that can potentially be better than being in your car, right? And so the one thing with BRT service is that frequency during the peak hours is like 10 minutes every 10 minutes. And so that helps making sure that you have dedicated lanes for the buses to get from station to station. That helps on-time performance for the buses to get to where they're going, and addresses that reliability question. Along with that, I think, you mentioned it, multimodal connections are important. Thinking about transit and how people access transit is important. And so trying to provide those connections as we plan the BRT project is definitely important. That's where like some of the station area planning work that we are doing for New Bern, and then we'll be doing in the coming near future for Western and the other corridors will be important, is because it takes a closer look at those station areas and how people are accessing the station areas. So I think that's also very important in terms of figuring out those multimodal connections. And then just the last thing I'll say is, I think what we're planning on with the BRT service is trying to be accommodating of all modes, having people be able to take their bicycles on the buses more easily, getting them on and off the buses more easily. Those are considerations that we're working through in the BRT design and making sure that those options are there.
I'll add that I think it's less about any kind of cultural change and more just about where people live and whether the built environment in those places supports walkability or transit use. The reality is in Raleigh, most of the city's growth took place at a time where driving was perceived to be the best option. And that is what most of the city looks like. I don't think it's realistic anymore that means that most people prefer driving. In fact, what we've heard when we've done a lot of community conversations is many people would vastly prefer to live in a walkable area with really good transit, but they're having trouble finding places because we didn't make many of those, and because there's sometimes not the housing options that they're looking for there. So it's not surprising if someone lives a few miles away from the nearest place to shop or get transit that they drive everywhere, but that doesn't mean that's what they prefer. If they could find a place to live, if we allowed more housing in a place that's walkable and served by transit, we know, because people have told us many times, that they would like to live in these places. So I think it's less a matter of cultural change and more a matter of allowing people to live in the kind of places where they can live the lifestyle that they would prefer.
Great. Thank you all for weighing in on that. So there were two questions that came in on the survey specifically about process, the process that kind of led to the creation of this report. And one has to do with streets and the other with the design opportunity areas. And I think I'll go with the streets one first. And I think this is for the design team as well as Jason Myers. What was the process for recommending new streets to add to the street plan? I think people were specifically curious why they didn't see more, and kind of what's that process to adding them, and how do streets kind of make the cut, if you will?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's something we struggle with, I think, in this process or any other planning process. The city has some connectivity standards in our Unified Development Ordinance, basically our subdivision code, that they're measured in block perimeter. Other jurisdictions use other tools, but we measure the perimeter around a block. If you were to walk around basically the entire block you live on, following public right of way, how far is that? And depending on the density and a few other things about zoning, we have those standards. So part of what we were using is kind of mapping those standards to the areas in the corridor study and the future land use that we were expecting to see in those places. But then rather than rely on just those standards, which sometimes given very specific situations on property are exempted on those properties, and sometimes just to help ensure that there's, I guess, rationality and I guess solid expectations between property owners. You know, if two different people own property and they have a common lot line and they are going to develop it, and somebody's going to have to, and they're both going to have to build a section of street, having the street plan map out where that'll go and which direction it will be, and whether it'll connect from point A to point B rather than point A to point C is a helpful way to set some expectations of those property owners through that development. And that would, you know, make it a little bit more feasible and help avoid surprises, I guess, in making sure that we map streets in the right places. But the other thing is that we want on the street plan there to be streets that have a function in the network. And so there are also streets that are shown on the area specific guidance that might be the right way to do something from an urban design standpoint, but don't necessarily do a lot for the network. And by network, I don't just mean cars, but all the other modes too. And those are places where we would encourage those to be built by development, but it's not necessarily a part of the citywide street plan. And so finding where that boundary is something that we're really looking for feedback on through this process to make sure that we're mapping the right streets in the right places. But we also want to make sure we map enough. And then another aspect of it is, you know, if we're adding a street that might be kind of through a neighborhood or connecting to some existing urban fabric and some existing land uses, and we only have one through there, that may funnel a fair amount of traffic to that one street, and that may not be a good outcome. But if we were to add 3 or 4 kind of spread out along a block pattern, each one of those streets can be a very quiet, low volume street and provide a lot of additional opportunities to walk and bike more safely, more comfortably. And so what we tried to do, I think, through this plan is map more narrow streets and make sure, and to kind of walk away from having fewer wide streets that aren't as well connected. So in an overarching theme, that's what we're trying to do, but we're looking at feasibility in terms of topography, in terms of property lines, in terms of existing development patterns. And, you know, for instance, if we knew there was a cemetery someplace, we're not going to map the street through a cemetery because that's a pretty sacred place that we don't want to disrupt. And there are many other reasons why we might not map a street where, if we were being ignorant of what's on the ground now, it would be, you know, the right way to draw the map. But hopefully that helps answer that question a little bit. I do think there's some urban design aspects to that too that I can let my colleagues answer as well.
So I can answer the question about how were the urban design opportunities developed. I think, you know, we were really inspired by the kind of implementation of the Capitol Boulevard plan, which was done in 2012, which many of us know now what that has resulted in, which is the reconfiguration of Capitol Boulevard and Peace Street to really open that area up and make it less of a more traditional auto kind of entry ramp, exit ramp sort of configuration to what we are seeing is happening now with the development of the Smoky Hollow, other developments coming online. And then it also created the opportunity to do Devereux Meadows Park, which is now in design phases. And that's, so that's occurring years later. It's occurring after the implementation of Capitol Boulevard. So knowing that Western Boulevard is a corridor that was built in the 80s or finished in the 80s with design thinking of probably the 60s or the 70s of this is a highway. 40 years later, this is an opportunity to try to really re-envision that. And though it's different than Capitol Boulevard and some of those configurations, there are similar sort of opportunities that were presented where, after BRT goes in, you're probably not going to take a major infrastructure change to Western Boulevard for a very long time, right? The implementation of BRT on Western is going to be a huge change to that. So that's the real opportunity to make changes that are inherent to the design of the corridor. What we also want to make sure that we did was that the design of the BRT corridor did not preclude doing improvements to other areas like around the parks, particularly around Pullen Park and Dorothea Dix Park. Some of these things will be tied together. So, we talked about the Pullen Bridge interchange. That's something that we're going to have to work on through the BRT design process as an integrated component of that, and look to city sources of funding to make sure that can be achieved. There are other areas where we just want to make sure that the design of BRT routing doesn't mean that we can't go back and do implement these ideas years later when there might be more funding for that sort of thing. So that was the real thinking behind how we develop these opportunity areas. And Western is a very long corridor. It goes through about every sort of context that you can find in the city, from downtown through the parks areas out to more single family, and then as Jason said, an opportunity to do a green street, a green filled street essentially. So there's a lot of concepts that were developed here that this is just kind of the first start to as we continue to implement BRT, to look to develop those ideas further.
Great, thank you both for that. So we have 2 minutes left, and I have 2 more questions. One I think is relatively short, and the other is about station area planning. So I think a lot of people, now that they've had the opportunity to review the report, their questions are, what's next? What do we do with all of this information that that we've all created? So my first question is a little more of a practical question that someone asked about construction. And people, were obviously worried because there are portions of the corridor that are 1 lane, or where there are 2 lanes, traffic is very fast. And, if lanes are getting closed, that's going to increase that speed. So people had questions about how the city would minimize impacts to accessibility to businesses along the corridor. I think I'll kick that to you, Het.
Yeah, that sounds good. So currently we're in the 0 to 30% design phase. When we have got to the 30% design phase, the next phase of design, which is final design, getting from 30 to 100%, is where we basically take a closer look at construction phasing and phasing in terms of maintenance of traffic, as well as how during the construction process a contractor would make sure that access to businesses remains, as well as making sure that there are limited impacts as they're getting through construction. So you're not going to go through construction on the entire corridor all at once. So you do go through step approach of where we may start and then where we may end, as well as kind of, there are large other capital projects that are identified on the Western Corridor. So there is going to be a lot of coordination with NCDOT and a lot of other projects that we want to make sure that from a construction schedule perspective, we're only disturbing certain areas once and then not having to have that impact again.
Great, thanks. And then my last question, or the last question that came up, a lot of people were asking questions that will likely be answered in the station area planning process, but that process is new to a lot of people, especially if they haven't been engaged in the New Bern station area planning process. So Jason Hard, I wanted to ask you briefly to kind of highlight what the station area planning process entails and when we expect to kick that off for the Western Boulevard corridor.
So that would involve taking a really close look at each individual station area. And you can think about it in terms of the walking distance to get to that station. So a 5 or 10 minute walk, about a half mile or so. So looking really closely in that area and thinking about a couple of really important issues. So one of which is walkability. And there was the question earlier about traffic speeds. That's a great opportunity to think about those speeds and just pedestrian comfort in general in those areas. We know bus rapid transit or transit in general will only be as successful as people feel comfortable walking to it. So that's going to be an important consideration. Also looking at some of the other issues that we've touched on. So first, do I feel comfortable walking somewhere? And are there places nearby to walk or to take transit to? So what is the mix of uses there? Is there a lively place where I can go do shopping, or the employment areas reachable nearby? And then finally, here and across Raleigh, we know people are very interested and concerned about housing choice. Can I find a place to live in the kind of walkable area that I would like to live in, and housing affordability? So it's an opportunity to look really closely at city investments or city regulations, like really technical zoning issues, to make sure that there's not barriers that are preventing people from realizing the vision that they have. In terms of the timeline, first we need to get to a really firm understanding of the BRT design on this corridor itself. Where exactly will the station areas be? And are there some design details to be worked out that would affect how we think about getting to the stations? Once that's finished, then we can jump into that station area planning conversation. So that looks like sometime, probably not in the coming 12 months, but sometime after that, we would be ready to begin that conversation along Western Boulevard.
Great, thanks, Jason. I want to thank you all for taking the time tonight, and I hope they were helpful for those of you listening live, or those of you who may tune in later and maybe add a little bit more context to the report and some helpful explanations as you review it to keep in mind in terms of what the report was trying to accomplish and what's still to come in later phases. For those of you watching now or later, it would be really helpful for us if you would, after reviewing the report and watching this, if you would take the time to fill out the survey. If you are watching this now, all you have to do is scroll down. The survey is on the same page that you're viewing this on, and that will remain the case. So again, thank you all for joining us tonight, and we look forward to engaging with you in the future.